The laughter started before Nathan Cole had both boots on the gravel. 3 men in pressed shirts stood at the top of the mansion's front steps, and when they saw the dusty pickup roll up the long desert drive and the man who climbed out of it, sun-worn, unshaven, wearing a field jacket washed too many times in gas station sinks, they laughed the way people laugh when they've already decided how a story ends. "That's him?" One of them said, not bothering to lower his voice. "That's the heir?" Nathan said nothing. He'd been laughed at in worse places by worse men, and it had never once changed what he came to do. But beside him, halfway out of the truck, the dog had gone perfectly still. Diesel's ears came forward, his body locked. He wasn't looking at the men on the steps. He was looking past them, at the house itself, at one dark window on the 2nd floor, and a low sound started in his chest that Nathan had learned, over 8 years and 2 continents, never to ignore. Before we go any further, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay with it until the very end, because what that dog was about to find inside those walls is something no one standing on those steps could have imagined. We read every comment, and we'd love to know how far this story travels. Nathan Cole was 43 years old and built like something that had been used hard and maintained anyway. He stood a shade over 6 feet, lean now in a way he hadn't been in uniform, the muscle turned to wire by 2 years of walking. His hair was dark and going gray at the sides, longer than regulation, pushed back with a hand that carried a tremor he'd learned to hide. There was a scar through one eyebrow and another along his jaw, and his nose had been broken and reset by a corpsman in a place he'd signed papers agreeing never to name. But it was the eyes people remembered. They were a pale, weathered blue, and they moved the way a searchlight moves, patient, complete, missing nothing. The eyes of a man who had spent a career learning that the thing that kills you is the thing you didn't check. He didn't fidget. He didn't fill silence. When the men on the steps laughed, he simply let his gaze pass over each of them. Once, the way you read a room you might have to leave through a different door than the one you came in. He was not unfriendly. Life had just sanded away the part of him that used to speak first. Everything he still owned in the world fit behind the seat of the truck, and he carried himself like a man who had lost the argument with the world and made a quiet peace with the loss. He had been Senior Chief Petty Officer Nathan Cole, Naval Special Warfare, and for 19 years the Navy had been the only home that ever fully held him. 3 deployments to Iraq, 2 to Afghanistan, a rotation through the Horn of Africa he still didn't talk about, a silver star he'd never framed, a Purple Heart he'd once traded for a bus ticket in a bad month he wasn't proud of. He'd come home from the last tour with a traumatic brain injury that made rooms too loud and mornings too long, and for a while he'd managed. Then his wife, Sarah, found a lump in the spring and was gone by the following winter, and the small, careful structure that kept him upright came apart all at once. The disability claim stalled in an office 2,000 miles away. The savings went to the funeral, and then to nothing. He hadn't fallen so much as slid, quietly, the way good men slide when no one is watching, from the house to the truck to the long gray country of men who used to be someone. Through all of it, he had kept exactly one thing that mattered. He had kept the dog. Diesel was an 8-year-old German Shepherd, 84 pounds of black and deep rust, his coat darkening to near black along the spine and shoulders like the shadow of a ridge at dusk. His right ear carried a notch where shrapnel had taken a piece of it outside Sangin, and he ran with a small hitch in his back leg from the same day, the day he'd found the pressure plate that would have taken Nathan's legs and had planted himself in the dirt and refused to move until the world understood. He was a trained explosives detection dog, and it had cost Nathan 6 months of fighting the kennel master and the paperwork, and his own pride to adopt him out of the program. He moved now with the clean, economical confidence of an animal that had learned the exact difference between noise and threat. He did not bark at strangers. He didn't waste himself on nothing. In 8 years, he had never once alerted on something that turned out to be nothing, which was why the low sound in his chest, aimed at that dark upstairs window, had already lifted the hair on the back of Nathan's neck. The house sat alone at the end of 2 miles of private dirt road, deep in the Sonoran Desert north of Tucson, where the saguaros stood like sentries against the Santa Catalinas, and the sky went on without apology in every direction. It was a low, sprawling thing of adobe and glass and weathered timber, beautiful and strange, half fortress and half hermitage. The late November air was warm and dry in the sun, and already sharpening toward the kind of cold that would come down hard off the mountains after dark. It smelled of creosote and dust and, faintly, of wood smoke from a chimney no one had lit in days. Somewhere behind the house, a windmill turned and creaked, turned and creaked. The loneliest sound in the world. The man at the center of the steps came down them now with his hand already out, the way men do when a handshake is a thing they intend to win. Preston Vance was 39, tanned and gym-kept, in a linen shirt that cost more than Nathan had spent on food in a year. He was the dead man's nephew, and by his own accounting, he was the dead man's rightful everything. Preston developed land, golf communities out past Scottsdale, the kind with fountains in the desert and gates that kept out the very view they'd bulldozed to build. He had connections at the county and a lawyer on retainer, and a buyer already circling the property with a number that had a lot of zeros and no soul in it. For the last 14 months, while his uncle grew frail and strange out here alone, Preston had made himself useful. A power of attorney signed in a shaky hand, accounts he'd offered to simplify, a slow, quiet current of money moving toward Scottsdale that nobody had been watching closely enough to question. He had spent those months certain that the desert and the house and the fortune underneath it would all, in the end, come to him. He had not planned on the will. He had not planned on the letter. And he had absolutely not planned on a homeless man and an old war dog standing in his driveway. "Look," Preston said, smiling wide, "I don't know what my uncle told you, or what you think that piece of paper means. But let me save you the long drive back to wherever you came from. This is my family's house. You should go." Nathan didn't take the hand. He reached into the inside pocket of the field jacket instead and drew out an envelope, soft at the corners from being carried a long way, and held it out. "He wrote to me," Nathan said. 3 weeks before he died. Preston's smile didn't move, but something behind it did. Inside the envelope was a single page in a careful, failing hand, the hand of Command Master Chief Raymond Vance, retired. The man who had once pulled Nathan out of the water off a coast that didn't exist on any map, who had been Nathan's team leader and then, for 2 decades, the closest thing to a father Nathan had left. Raymond, who had gone to ground in the desert after the money came, who had stopped answering his phone, who had, it turned out, been dying alone out here with a nephew circling and a housekeeper holding his hand. The letter said, "If you're reading this, I finally quit. The house is yours, son, not the moneymen's, not Preston's. Yours. There's more here than the walls. Trust the dog. He always was smarter than both of us." "That's not a will," Preston said, reading over his shoulder, the warmth gone out of his voice like heat off asphalt at sundown. "That's a sad old man's note. I have the will. Filed, witnessed, executed. You have a letter and a dog." Behind Preston, a screen door opened, and a small woman in her 70s stepped out onto the portal with a dish towel still in her hands. She stopped when she saw Nathan, and something crossed her face that was not fear but recognition. Diesel's head turned toward her, and the low sound in his chest went quiet. His tail moved, once, slowly. He walked to her and sat at her feet without being asked, and pressed his shoulder gently against her knee. Nathan watched the dog do it, and understood, the way you understand weather, that whoever this woman was, Diesel had already decided she stood on the right side of things. "Rosa," Preston said, not turning around, his voice flat. "Go back inside. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me," Nathan said quietly, and it was the first time he'd let anything into his voice at all. He was not loud. He had never once in his life needed to be loud. "Who is she?" Preston smiled again, the salesman coming back up over the crack in him. "She's the help. She was the help. She's out Friday. Now, I've been more than patient. Get in your truck." Nathan didn't get in the truck. He crouched down beside Diesel and the old woman, and asked her, in the low, even tone he'd once used to talk frightened men through the worst nights of their lives, how long she'd worked for Raymond. 22 years, she told him. Her name was Rosa Delgado. She'd nursed the old man through the end, spooned broth when his hands shook too badly to hold the cup, sat up with him the nights the desert got into his head, and he thought he was back on a boat off some black coast. She told him, glancing once at Preston, then deciding she was past the point of caution, that in the last months Preston had come often, always with papers, always alone with the old man behind a closed door, and that after each visit Raymond had grown quieter and more afraid. She told him Preston had already sold 2 of Raymond's trucks and cleared out the gun safe and taken a painting down off the study wall, and that a man from a moving company had come to measure rooms while Raymond was still warm in the ground. And she told him the thing that made Nathan go very still, that in his last lucid week Raymond had gripped her wrist and told her, over and over, that the important things were in the wall, with the dog's help, and had made her promise to find the right man. "I didn't know who the right man was," Rosa whispered. "Then the dog walked up to me." Preston had stopped smiling. He'd taken out his phone. "I'm calling the county," he announced, "to the desert in general. This is trespassing. There's a homeless man and an aggressive animal on private property." He did make a call, but Nathan noticed it was short and murmured, and to no one who sounded like a dispatcher. 20 minutes later, a black SUV came up the dirt road, and 2 men who moved like private security got out and stood at the bottom of the steps with their arms crossed. And Preston's confidence came flooding back into him. What Preston did not know was that Nathan had spent the drive that morning doing the one thing his old life had trained into his bones. He had made calls of his own to a JAG officer he'd served beside, now practicing estate law in Phoenix, to a sheriff's investigator whose brother-in-law Nathan had carried down a mountain in 2009. He had learned, before he ever turned up the drive, that no will Preston had filed matched the one Raymond's real attorney of record had drafted, and attorney Preston had quietly frozen out 8 months back. Nathan mentioned none of that. He just stood up and looked at the house and said to the dog, "Diesel, seek." For a moment nothing happened, and Preston laughed, a short, ugly bark of a laugh, and told his 2 men to put the vagrant back in his truck. One of them started up the steps. Rosa made a small, frightened sound, and Nathan felt the old cold arrive in him, the flat, clean calm that used to come down like a visor before the worst part of a night, the calm that had kept him alive when louder men had not survived it. He did not raise his hands. He simply said, without heat, "I'd think hard about the next thing you do," and something in the way he said it stopped the man on the 3rd step, with one boot still in the air. "Because Preston had an order coming," he said. "He'd have a judge by Monday. He had the paperwork. He had the name, he had the money, and everyone standing here in the dust was going to be gone by Friday and forgotten by spring. And the terrible thing was that he was mostly right. On paper, Preston Vance owned the ground they stood on. On paper, Nathan Cole was a homeless man with a letter and a limping dog. Rosa's hands had started to shake. She was 74 years old, and she was about to be put out of the only home she'd had for 22 years by a man who'd robbed a dying friend, and for one long moment out there in the enormous, indifferent light of the desert, it looked exactly like every other time the men with money and lawyers simply win. Then, from somewhere deep inside the house, they all heard the dog begin to bark. Diesel had gone in through the screen door Rosa left open, and now his bark came steady and hard and unmistakable from the far rooms. Not the frantic sound of a dog that wants attention, but the flat, repeating alert of a dog that has found the exact thing it was trained a whole lifetime to find. Nathan was already moving. He went up the steps and past Preston and through the cool, dim rooms toward the sound, and the others followed, because a bark like that pulls people the way gravity does. He found Diesel in the study, planted in front of a floor-to-ceiling bookcase of dark oak, sitting the way he sat for only one thing in the world: spine straight, nose fixed on a seam in the wood, absolutely motionless, waiting to be told he'd done well. Nathan knelt beside him and put a hand on his back and felt the old current run between them. "Good boy," he said softly. "Show me." The seam in the paneling was almost invisible. Nathan ran his fingers along it the way he'd once cleared door frames in the dark, and found the catch low and to the right, disguised as a knot in the grain, and the whole section of shelving swung inward on a hinge with a breath of colder, older air. Behind it was a small room, no bigger than a closet, and a gunmetal door set with a keypad, and Diesel pressed forward and sat again in front of it, certain, insistent. On the wall beside the keypad, in Raymond's failing hand, someone had written 5 numbers in pencil, faint and small. Nathan keyed them in. The lock released with a heavy sound. Preston shoved forward then, all the pretense gone out of him, his voice climbing. "That's mine. Whatever's in there is part of the estate. That's my property." But the sheriff's trucks were already coming up the dirt road. 3 of them now, dust rising gold in the low sun, because the investigator Nathan had called that morning had heard enough in a single phone call to send them. Nathan stepped back and let the door swing open, and let every person in that room see. It was all in there. Along one wall, in neat stacks, sat cash and gold, Krugerrands and bars in a fireproof case, bearer bonds in labeled folders, the 2 hard, careful decades of a man who had never trusted a bank as far as he could throw it. Later it would be counted and totaled and printed in a report, $6,700,000 and change. But the money was not the secret. The secret was the slim leather folder on the shelf, and Nathan lifted it and opened it in front of them all. Inside was Raymond Vance's true and final will, dated and witnessed 9 months earlier by his real attorney, leaving the house and its contents to Nathan Cole, leaving a lifetime trust and the guest cottage to Rosa Delgado, and leaving Preston Vance exactly $1 and a single handwritten line. And beneath the will lay a ledger, page after page in Raymond's shaking hand, documenting every transfer Preston had moved to Scottsdale across 14 months, dates, amounts, account numbers. A dying man quietly building the case that would bury the nephew who thought he'd already won. Investigator Ruiz read the ledger on the study desk while a deputy read Preston his rights. Preston's voice broke exactly the way the money men's voices always break. First, the threats. "My lawyers will bury all of you. You have no idea who I am." And then, when the cuffs actually closed around his wrists, The pleading. "This is a misunderstanding. That's my uncle's money. I was managing it. Rosa, tell them." Rosa said nothing. She had her hand buried in the fur of Diesel's neck. Nathan didn't gloat, and he didn't smile. He watched the man who had laughed at him on the steps get walked out into the last of the daylight, past the two security men who were suddenly very interested in the horizon, and he felt no triumph in it. Only the old tiredness, and underneath the tiredness, something he hadn't felt in a long time and didn't yet have a name for. "You were the right man," Rosa said beside him, very quietly. Nathan looked down at the dog. "He was," he said. By the following spring, the house had changed. Nathan Cole had not sold it, though the buyer with the soulless number had called twice. Instead, with a portion of what Raymond left him and the plain blessing of the will's intent, he had begun turning the sprawling adobe fortress into something Raymond would have understood, a quiet place where veterans coming apart the way Nathan had come apart could sit a while in the enormous desert light and be around men who didn't need the story explained. The first 4 had already arrived. Rosa still cooked, though now she was paid properly and lived in the cottage with the deed in her own name, and she fussed over the new men like a grandmother and told them not to leave crumbs for the dog. Preston Vance had pleaded out to felony exploitation of a vulnerable adult and multiple counts of fraud. The Scottsdale development collapsed along with him, and the last anyone heard he was selling timeshares in Henderson under a supervised restitution order that would follow him for years. And in the long gold evenings, when the heat came up off the ground and the Catalinas went purple, Nathan sat on the portal with a cup of coffee and watched Diesel, grayer now around the muzzle, the hitch in his back leg a little worse, chase a jackrabbit he had no intention of catching across the open desert, barking with a joy that had nothing careful left in it at all. His hand still shook some mornings. The quiet still came down hard some nights. But he had stopped waiting to be somewhere else. He was already home. Sometimes miracles don't come down as thunder from the sky. Sometimes they arrive dusty and unshaven at the end of a long dirt road, in a truck that holds everything a man has left, with a war-worn dog-riding shotgun. God does not always hand us back what the world has taken. The years, the wife, the savings, the quiet certainty that we still count for something. But sometimes he plants one loyal heart beside us that simply refuses to quit, and he waits until the exact moment we're finally ready to stop driving, and then he shows us that the thing we thought we'd lost was only hidden. In a wall, in a promise, in the plain decency of the people who choose not to look away. The men who laughed on those steps had money, and lawyers, and every advantage the world can hand a person. What they did not have was a single soul who would stand beside them when it mattered. That, in the end, is the only fortune that ever counts. If Nathan and Diesel's story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder today that loyalty still exists and that no good man is ever truly forgotten. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever been counted out by people who decided your story was already over. We'd like to hear that too. Your words might be the light that gets someone else through tonight. And if you believe in stories of courage, faith, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next journey. May God bless you, protect your family, and remind you always, no matter how far you've fallen or how alone the road feels, that you are never, ever walking it by yourself.